Okay, hello everybody to macroeconomics. And last week we have finished our talking about our target system, which we call the magic square. And yeah, in order to roughly or shortly recapitulate what we have done, I will talk about these four targets a little bit again. And then also we want to talk that at this point, of course, the story does not end. That, of course, we are looking at other targets and what other reasonable targets we can look at. This we will do after our recapitulation. So steady and appropriate growth, which aggregated variable, on which aggregated variable do we look at when we are talking about economic growth? Which variable we then have in mind? When we just say, well, our economy has grown by 3% the last year. Pardon? No. Economic growth. What is the key variable? Well, we have talked a lot about this. Then we looked at GDP, but GDP, all goods and services within one period, within a country, for final consumption and market prices. So we have these two parts, price development and development of quantity. Somehow we can interpret this as the total revenue of a country, interpreting this country as a firm. So this number can increase by just inflation, by just higher prices, increasing prices. And so if we want to talk about growth, then of course we want to get rid of this price effect. We have talked a lot about this. So then we looked at the relative change of real GDP. And there we said roughly within 1 to 3% per annum. This would be a reasonable, quantitative aim for developed countries. Or we could also say, or if we want to get rid of the migration effect, then we would say real GDP per capita. Price level stability. At which number, when we talk about inflation, at which number do we look then? Yeah, explicitly, when we say, well, inflation last year was 2.5%, somehow we have to calculate this number. Pardon? No, not the interest rate. Interest rate, this is not the prices. The price level we have measured by looking at these standard representative basket. What are we consuming on average? And this we have called the consumer price index. And then for the European Union, for the European Monetary Union, there we have also developed a system that we are measuring all prices in the same way in every Euro country, and this was done then with the HCPI, the Harmonized Consumer Price Index. And there, then we have the relative change of these Harmonized Consumer Price Index, or you can also learn only the Consumer Price Index, and there we had said of roughly 2% change per annum in the medium term, and here also not too volatile. Well, high level unemployment. There, of course, we looked at the unemployment rate. And there we discussed that zero, we wouldn't be 0%, wouldn't be a good choice because we have, so to speak, a minimum level because of our social security system, and there we said then roughly 3 to 4%. Well, and in the end, external balance, we could think of a balanced trade balance or current account, or not too volatile exchange rate, or in general not a dependence on foreign countries, on the development of other countries. But overall, we have to admit that we actually do not look at such parameters in Germany, especially when we have a regime of flexible exchange rates, because then you don't need to intervene via the central bank. We will talk about this later. Because of the capital in or capital outflows to stabilize your exchange rate, because you admit that they just fluctuate as they want. So in general, there is no definite aggregate variable. Sometimes one looks at trade balance, current account, exchange rate, or general dependence on foreign countries, not too volatile, but with flexible exchange rates in Germany. We do not look at these parameters, because with flexible exchange rate, as I said, you obtain just an adjustment of your exchange rate when you have the capital in or outflows. Okay, and now we want to go on and ask what other reasonable aims we could formulate. And doing this, I will take again Germany as an example. And oops, where are my slides here? And if we look in our main law, in our constitution, then there we find also some other formulated economic aims, and one would be sustainable and ecological conditions. Well, of course, nowadays this is the general issue of climate change. This we see now is very costly, and this would be in the long run a reasonable aim that we care about this is, I think, clear. And we introduced this in Germany roughly 45 years ago. So in the 1980s, this was introduced that the state shall protect the natural foundations of life and animals in accordance with our constitutional order through legislation and through the executive power. Here we have the economic policy, of course, in its responsibility for future generations. Because, well, of course, look at the United States. They, with their current government, they do not care very much about it. Well, but you have to pay it in the end, because that it is there and that there something will happen, that the weather in general will change, and that more hurricanes and other things are costly. This is definitely clear. Of course, as a society, we can decide not caring about it, but of course, the cost will anyway come. And well, we will see how this will go on, because unfortunately, these costs have not only the reasons within one country, this is a global question. And then we find, oops, another one. This is, oops, oh, here, this should be the first slide. So, sustainable and ecological conditions. Then, of course, and this is, yeah, quite interesting. If you think about the reasons for growth, then of course many reasons for growth are innovations and are, yeah, is especially your power as young people, that you see, well, if I start learning something and and if I work hard, then you see, well, my aim is to earn more than maybe my parents. And this means if you have not a flat income distribution, so if you have in society differences that you can see, well, if I work harder, then I can buy me a larger a car or something like this. This fosters, of course, economic growth. But on the other hand, we see in societies in general, if you have a very polar distribution of income, That you have here very rich people and on the other side very poor people. Then you see in general that this dampens growth. Of course, you think of if I work harder, then I can climb up the ladder. But on the other way, if you have many poor people, then maybe they say, well, why are these people so rich? I just go to them and that you have some political clash within your country. And even in the end, some maybe even a civil war. Look at the United States, what there happens right now. The military is going into the cities, and mainly we have to admit that this government looks a little bit more onto the rich people there. So of course, if you have this tension within a society, then this, of course, also dampens economic growth. And because of this, we have in our constitution a law which says that the government have to look at a fair, balanced. And this is important. This does not mean that everybody has to earn the same, that you have a very flat income distribution. This allows still for differences. Because I also argued differences are also in a way good for economic growth. Too much differences are bad for economic growth. And therefore, we have in our constitution that we should look at a fair, balanced income distribution. Well, and this is, as we have seen in the circular flow, this is all about this tax subsidy mechanism which we find. That we tax more the rich than the poor. So that we have a redistribution via this tax subsidy mechanism. But of course, in the end, when we are vote, then our society votes about the question, how much shall we redistribute? So there it is, we cannot formulate in an economic way, well, a specific number of of the distribution is the right one, as we have formulated for economic growth within 1 to 3%. This would be a quite reasonable number. So we cannot say only 10% should be much richer than the other one. This is always every 5 years when we are voting, always a decision of our society. But that there we have this general effect, this is empirically, we find this empirically quite well established, that we have these both true argumentations. In general, differences are good, too much differences are bad, but we cannot, so to speak, calculate out of a model what is then the right income distribution. What would be the best? This is always then a political decision. Okay, and the last one is sustainable public finance budget. This is right now a very much discussed problem in Europe, especially because of the increase of the of financing the military due to the Russian aggression. And also we find this in our constitution. This was just changed in March this year by the new by the parliament, because in order to change our constitution we need a majority of 2/3, and this was yeah, actually quite funny, because this decision was made by the old parliament, although we have already voted. So we had already the majority for the new government, but the decision was made by the old parliament, and the reason was that the distribution in the old parliament, there you could have this majority of 2/3, which the new government in the new parliament didn't have. And also, if I will show you the law in a minute, which we find in the German constitution. And we have also on a European level, there explicitly two numbers that we define that the public deficit should not be larger than 3%, and that the government debt ratio, so the overall debt of a country, shouldn't be larger than 60%. This was during the process of the unification of Europe, founding the European Union. There in the midst of the 90s, we defined these two rules where we also had some definite numbers where we should look at. But here, especially if we look at this deficit criterion, since the financial crisis, afterwards the euro crisis, then Corona, and right now the very hard situation with the new government in the United States and the Russian aggression, there we see that we almost couldn't reach this deficit criterion. Okay, but this we hadn't. What is meant by a fair balanced income distribution? And this means that the federation shall have the right to legislative if, to an extent, that the establishment of equivalent living conditions. So again, here, this doesn't mean that everybody has to earn the same. So this still allows for differences in income. This means more or less everybody should have the same economic chances. Well, and I think here you are coming, some of you coming from other countries. Maybe you can have a look in your constitution, what is written there about these further aims in general for maybe income distribution, climate change, or fiscal rules. And the last one is quite long. Oops, this is in German, and this I have to translate, sorry. How did I call this? Sustainable public financial budget. And where do we find the main things? So in general, everything should be balanced. So this would mean that all our expenditure via the government should be financed via taxes. So this is the general rule. Generally, every public expenditure should be financed by taxes, but then we define what is meant that we have a balanced budget, that we allow for a little deficit, and this is defined here. The details are regulated for the federal budget in another article, and this means from loans if it does not exceed 0.35% in relation to gross domestic product. Public budget is defined to be balanced if the deficit does not exceed 0.35% relative to GDP. Well, maybe this looks a bit funny. Where does this number 0.35 comes from? Why is it not 1% or 0.5 or something like this? Well, the first time we introduced in Germany this fiscal rule was in 2009. And in 2009, 0.35% relative to the gross domestic product in 2009 was roughly 10 billion euros. So a quite general number when you say, well, let's allow for some deficit. Should it be 10, 15, or 20 billion euros? And then in this time, but then during this time, remember that we have this price effect. In 2009, we had roughly 3 trillion euros as nominal GDP. So 0.35 is roughly uh, um, um, uh, 1 over 300. So it corresponds to 10 billion euros. But right now we have a nominal GDP of 4.3 trillion euros due to economic growth and due to inflation. And so then writing within the law the number to 10 billion euros would now mean that 10 billion euros are now much less compared to 10 billion euros in 2009. And therefore, within this law, you write also a relative number of this 0.35%. Okay, but then we found that this fiscal rule is especially to the new situation of the Russian aggression, and with respect, I talked about this also already within this lecture, that we have to renew our infrastructure in our country, also that we have to make public investment into digitalization and so on. And because of this, and also of course climate change, and because of this, we found that this rule is a little bit too restrictive. And therefore, then especially, we introduced that here on civil protection, civil defense, and so on. If this exceeds 1% of nominal GDP, so the expenditure into, in general, military, which exceeds more than 1% of GDP, this we do not count anymore. So this is not counted in the financial budget anymore. So we can then finance this out of the general system. And maybe you know that we start to increase in the European Union the military expenditure to roughly 3.5% in the next years. So in Germany, this would mean that in general, roughly 50 billion euros per year we do not count anymore. Okay, so that's it for these further targets, which we also find in the law, in the German constitution, and especially if we look at this aim of sustainable and public financial budget. Here I brought you also some numbers to this, that in general we see in the last 25 years that we quite often have not matched this 3% European Maastricht criterion. And here we find this 60%. So here 3%. And 60% Maastricht criteria. And especially here, this was the financial crisis. And this, of course, was Corona. And well, right now we almost match this 3% criterion. But there we have to admit, this is not because we have so much money, but the deficit is calculated relative to nominal GDP. Oh, here we need nominal. And since the nominal GDP, and we have seen this, has increased in the last years very much just only because of the price effect, this is the main reason that we match the criterion right now of 3% and not because of a good economic performance. This is also always important how we can interpret, how we read these variables. Okay, so then we want to close in general this topic of general economic policy aims, and we come to the next topic of the so-called economic growth and business cycle. And we have talked about this already when we talked about unemployment and the cyclical component of unemployment. And there, in general, we find that if we look at the data on the development of an economy in general, then we see that in general we have this long-term trend. This should be hopefully within these sustainable, not too volatile long-term growth, roughly 1 to 3%, and that we then fluctuate every year around these long-term trend. And that we see in the data that we have always these 4 different periods of a period of expansion, that we then come in a peak or a boom, that then this boom phase ends and we fall in the recession and even a trough, and then again this period starts again, expansion and so on. And roughly we can say that these 4 periods together, that we find this circle within roughly 7 to 10 years. And I will show you that we find this even especially for Germany when I show you then the data starting from reunification. What do you mean here? I have a question in the chat. What do you mean by odious? That we have a too large debt ratio, or what do you mean by this?
So odious debt is money that government officials take for personal use, that is not for economic growth for a country or anything related to
Okay,
that.
okay.
Yeah.
So she just asked if the government takes the money just for personal use. Well, the answer in general is at first, of course, neutral. If you look at the expenditure approach of GDP, if you have a richer person, then in general we assume that this person then consumes also more. And this, of course, buying more products, then you have a higher growth rate. But of course, in general, if you then ask within your country yourself, well, you could spend this money relatively also on other aspects, for example, for education or for infrastructure, that then you would have relatively a higher effect on economic growth. And what one can maybe also argue is that people in the government take out money from the country for personal use, that maybe quite often they do not buy the products within the country, but they buy products from foreign countries. And then, of course, this money would be gone for your country.
But sir,
So,
what if this
so
is
it's
recurring?
so in general, you can say at the first step, it doesn't matter who has the money. But if you then think a little bit more about it, then you can answer, then you can say, well, if you can spend this money for better issues than only for personal. We will see later when we go to our theoretical models in the second part of this lecture, that in general we say, well, if consumption increases, then of course also the GDP increases. But then you can ask, can I spend my money in other aspects where the increase is larger than only increasing consumption? Yeah. So we will then talk later about this aspect a little bit more. So let's come back to the business cycle. So in general, we find this, and this is a quite broad region, 7 to 10 years. So the hard aspect for the government to steer the economy is then, well, when are we in a turning point? So if I'm here and the recession starts, then I should start to do something against it. Or if I'm already in this part of expansion, then it wouldn't be a good choice to really push even more your economy. And this is a quite hard aspect, always to find at which point are we in the business cycle. Okay, and what happens within these different periods? Of course, in the period of expansion, in general, we see an increase of production, an increase of utilization of our production capacities. This would mean we need more people. Hiring more people means a decreasing unemployment rate. And of course, a decreasing unemployment rate means that in general, the people have more money, more people are employed. And this, of course, means that we have an increase of demand. And think again of your market diagram, supply and demand. So an outward shift of your demand curve would then also mean that with free markets, you should not be surprised that also the prices will start to rise in such a situation. Then we come to the peak, and here we have overutilization of the capacities. We have the additional hours that you do not work only 40 hours, but 45 hours per week, and so on. So increasing extra hours, for example. Of course, working longer means also earning more money. And again, we have this effect that in general wages increase now and prices. And now what could happen in such a situation that you have a larger wage increase than the price increase. And this then means in such a situation when you have this overutilization that you then in this situation you cannot increase anymore the quantity. But if the wage increase is larger than the price increase, you have a problem with your profits because profits is revenue minus costs. And if the wage increase is larger than the general price increase, then this means although even your revenue is increasing, your costs are increasing more. And this means that your profits become lower and even there can then be a situation where you have losses and no profits anymore. And this is then this turning point in the boom phase, where you drop then in a phase of stagnation because you cannot meet the total demand anymore because of this overutilization. And then we are at this point here and the downturn begins. And in this recession, then of course, the production is falling. We do not hire new people anymore, and even the people have to leave the enterprises. Unemployment is increasing, income is decreasing, and this, of course, then also means declining consumption now. And this becomes better and better, and then we come to the low level, to the trough, low level production, and with this high unemployment levels. And here, actually, we have to see or we have to try to get out of this trough. And especially after Corona, we thought that this new period in the business cycle of again an expansion would come more or less automatically. And unfortunately, and this we will see when we go in the real data for Germany on a quarterly basis, that we do not see this general period of expansion after a recession and after a trough right now. Right now, we have a very long period of stagnation, but we will see this in a minute. Okay, so and then what's interesting, what is this long-term trend? And in order to discuss what could be this long-term trend, because only saying, well, it is the long-term average calculated from the last 20 years, this couldn't be it, because we have talked here what is the possibility of our production within our country. And this is maybe right now our main problem, that this has changed. What is the possible production, not what we are producing, what is possible, because our education level has declined, our infrastructure has declined, and we haven't invested that much in digitalization as other countries. So especially Southeast Asia, and so there are countries which have overtaken us. 20 years ago, most products also in electronics came from Europe, the United States, and Japan. And right now, even from Vietnam, we find these products. And of course, China and Singapore, Taiwan, they have now even better products than we in Europe. And this is then called the concept of potential output. Because in general, of course, we also want to limit, as always, the fluctuation around these long-term trend. And what is this potential output? This potential output is the maximum amount an economy can produce over the long run. So this would mean production at full capacity. And there you see now the argumentation. We are fluctuating about our utilization of this possible production level. And I also have to add here in normal times. So what would then our long-term aim? Our long-term aim of economic policy should then be not to just decrease to decrease unemployment or to increase economic growth for the next 1 or 2 years. This we can do. We have talked 10 minutes ago about this. This we can also do in just spending money. If everybody in a country gets from the government €1,000, then of course this pushes economic growth for 1 year, because we will spend this additional money. But this does not increase the long-term trend, because only everybody has €1,000 more. This does not increase your production capacity. So the long-term aim then should be that hopefully we get up this long-term trend. So only getting up the economic growth for 1 or 2 years this wouldn't be a good choice for economic policy. Yep, 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 yes. Yeah, but we see then that you have a little time lag between the increase of prices and we have seen this in the financial crisis, for example, that especially in the United States, they got a tax rebate. Every guy in the United States has got a tax rebate of roughly 1,000 US dollars. And this, for a short period, really pushed economic growth or the expenditure. Of course, a second effect is then that you have, where did I had it here? Also a price adjustment. About this, we will also talk later on when we are in our theoretical models. And I also said already there is one school, the Keynesians, and the other one, the neoclassical ones. And they actually discuss exactly what you have talked about. So what happens if everybody in the country gets an additional 1,000 euros? Then one argumentation is everybody has this additional 1,000 euros and now starts to buy more goods. Therefore, we have an increase of production. And the other ones, also a very logic argumentation is nothing happens because everybody knows that everybody has an additional 1,000 euros. Well, they go to the supermarket, want to buy more goods, but as I know that everybody has more money, I just increased by 1 to 1 the prices. Yeah. And then we see, and if we have a look at the data, that this market here, this price mechanism is not, yeah, working with 100%. So that we do not see this direct price adjustment, that you have really a real effect only because of a nominal increase. But on the other hand, and this was then after this period, after financial crisis up to Corona, after Corona, we had this price increase that if you then think, well, we always can do this, fostering growth by giving the people additional money, then in the long run, you see that the economy drops a little bit more in this neoclassical view, and that then really the prices start to increase, but not directly. But also we will talk about this when we are talking about the different schools of thought in economics. Okay, so please keep this in mind that potential output, the concept of the maximum amount of production in an economy, but you really have to keep in mind that this is only a theoretical concept. We do not see this in the market. In the market, we see only the definite production. So we can only estimate what can be this potential output. But then if you take this concept and this concept of business cycle, well, it sounds again quite reasonable, but do we find it in the data? And here is the so-called output gap. Again, we calculate this relative number for Germany, that we take the actual gross domestic product, subtract potential output, and divide by potential output. Then we obtain a relative number. And here we see that by I more or less, let's take red here, more or less we can fit in here such a business cycle. And if you look at it here, it starts in 1980 until roughly 1990. So this is roughly 10 years again until 2000, also roughly 10 years. Then only until the financial crisis, maybe roughly 8 years. Oh, this we can, yeah. So that we, within the data, we find more or less these numbers, but also we have to admit that in the near history, especially also because of Corona here, we do not find any more that definite business cycle as we have found it in history. And we have to see if this will come back. And let's at first just go to this. This is then the quarterly data for Germany. And here, this is then our long-term trend. And here also you see, well, this business cycle around this long-term trend. We see that the volatility has become during the last 20 years much larger, and also what I have already talked about, the unfortunate situation for Germany that since Corona we have only this stagnating process here. That we have really a huge problem if you look. This is the long-term trend calculated over these almost 40 years, and that we really are now in a situation of stagnation now already in the third year. And hopefully we will come up again because, yeah, my forecast is that if this turns on in Germany, that then also the political pressure in our country will become larger. So, and what we also can see, and let's now go even more in history. Here we are starting in the 1970s. That we can also see, historical events within our data series. And since this is quarterly data, well, in general, we see that a fluctuation of quarterly data of plus minus growth rates. This happens in general, even in periods of prosperity. Let's say 2 or 3 years, your economy is doing quite well. You will then, even in this period, see 1 or 2 negative quarters. But in general, we see here some periods where you have many negative quarters. Let's say this is the first one around here, the second, then here, the third one, here, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth one. and maybe also this one as the seventh. And I think you have almost about every event in history also talked in your school times. So if you look at this here, 1972, 1973, what happened? And this has not only happened in Germany. If you look in the data of almost all developed countries in the world, and you find around 1973 an economic downturn. What has happened? Pardon? No, in 1973, we didn't have a financial crisis. Yeah, you have an idea? Vietnam War was in the 1960s. It's here, around 1973. What happened? Which was a global economic shock in 19, roughly in the 19, beginning of the 1970s. You can also ask your artificial intelligence. Oil crisis. Yes, this was the first oil crisis. So after World War II, we had the United States, we had especially UK, that they were sitting on the oil in the Arabian region. And then there the countries established themselves, especially Saudi Arabia, and the OPEC was formed. And then the OPEC, in the beginning of the 1970s, they just said, well, we stop delivering oil to the developed countries, to the United States, to Europe. And since we are so dependent, and we are still so dependent on oil, on this specific good, and we also have talked about this when we looked at inflation. There we calculated the impact of energy prices, and this is mainly the impact of oil prices on inflation. And here, really, this was the aspect that they really said, well, we do not deliver anymore or a large amount of oil to the developed countries. And this meant even in Germany that we, by law, it was forbidden to drive on Sundays. There are the people on the highways, we were walking on Sundays during this year. Okay, but then they opened up again. And then we have number two. This is roughly 1979, 1980. What happened there? Also a global economic shock. The internet can also participate. Just type in what happened, which was a global economic shock. Chernobyl was 1985, but this wasn't hadn't that large economic effect. Yeah, this was then afterwards the development, high inflation rates. But which event started this? Well, we had an impact also on the US economy. Well, this was the so-called second oil crisis. But the starting point was not that the OPEC again said we won't deliver oil anymore, but what was the starting event of the second oil crisis, 1980, 1979, and then further on 1980. Yes, this was the revolution in Iran, and then more or less directly the war between Iran and Iraq. And Iran and Iraq were in these times one of the most oil production producing countries in the world. So the second oil crisis, Iranian revolution plus Iran Iraq war. Well then, third, roughly around 1991, this is a specific downturn in Germany. Yep, yes, this was the reunification of Germany, and unfortunately, we saw that this was quite costly. Then number four, around 2000, 2001. This was also a general economic downturn in the world, global on a global scale.
9/11, maybe?
Yes, but this 9/11 was then has then unfortunately come additionally. The starting point was another thing. So 9/11 was in 2001. But this,
Um,
of course, you are right. This had also a global impact on the economy. But we have an economic event starting already in the year 2000.
was it when the stock market
Yes,
plummeted?
this was a stock market crash. And what was the reason for the stock market crash in the year
I
2000?
think it was the housing
Uh,
project. I
no,
think
not the housing bubble. This was then later in the financial crisis. Yes, this is the dot-com bubble. Plus later on then 9/11. And then fifth, this is, I think, a little bit easier because you remember maybe this also already, 2008, 2009, financial crisis. Yes. Well, then this turmoil here, this is Corona. Well, in Corona, we more or less cannot say that there we have a general economic development because we just followed the epidemic. And then we, of course, see the shutdowns, shutting down during winter time, opening up again over 2, 3 years in during summertime. This, of course, there we have then economic developments, but this is not a general economic development which we can explain by market reactions because it was just by law that it was for many people it was not allowed to work. Remember, I gave you this number that in Germany we had 6 to 7 million in people in short-term work during Corona. And then our current situation, this is then Ukraine, and I add nowadays additionally Mr. Trump. This is, I think we can already say this that his decisions or his very volatile decisions. Or I don't know if you can talk about talking about him that you can say that he makes decisions. He doesn't make anything. He does something, and of course, this very volatile framework of the most powerful economy in the world have, of course, a global impact on the economy, and it is not the best one. Okay, so then that's it. What I wanted to talk about the business cycle, and yeah, due to the time, because now comes the last descriptive part, which more or less was always in behind when we are talking about an economy, that in general money is just the veil of a market society or a market organized society. And because of this, I also want, yeah, in a detail with you about money, but due to the time, I think in general we stop today here, and then we start with this very important topic, understanding what is money, what kind of impact has a change in money on the economy, and then of course you already mentioned it. We have a general dependence between money and interest rates. Interest rates are also very important then for our investment decisions. Um, that I think tomorrow and next week we will then start to talk about what is money about. So, thank you very much for today.